Okay, I think we're all online now. Hopefully everybody can hear. We're not having any problems. So I'm going to hand you over now to Anastasia Charbin, who is the Worldwide Fashion and Apparel Marketing Director for Lectra. So over to you, Stacey.
Thank you, Heather. Welcome, everyone. Welcome this afternoon. And for those of you on the West Coast, welcome and good morning. Good morning to you. Time to get up. So as Heather mentioned, she makes me feel a little bit old, I have to say. 20 years experience is a long time in technology for fashion and apparel. And I really had the privilege of working with so many fashion customers around the world. It's been a lot of fun. So here at Lectra, I'll give a little bit of information about who we are, but that'll come at the end of the presentation. We are a French-based company based here in France. We have 23,000 customers around the world, over 40 years in the business, and we have over 30 subsidiaries around the world. So why am I telling you this? It's because it gives us a pretty good vantage point as far as what's happening with different fashion and apparel companies around the world. We also, of course, have teams that do gobs and gobs of market research, market analysis. We have many, many case studies that we've collected over the years. So we're in a pretty good position to see how the ways of working are evolving, especially since the crisis in 2008, economic crisis, and of course, we'll call it the democratization of fashion and the dispersion of fashion on the internet has had a huge impact on us all. So let's jump right into it. In order to, before we get started, we'll take just one minute to cover what is a fashion business model? What is a fashion or apparel business model? That is to say, how do companies work? Why is this important? It's because we have noticed, and it's not just us, but many analysts around the world have noticed that changes in a business model or fundamental changes in how a company operates and the value that it offers to the market will bring more sustainable value than technological evolutions. This might seem pretty funny from me, coming from a technology company, but we have found systematically over the years, without fail, that a misguided application of technology will normally result in a much worse situation than a technology project that is done correctly. Even Bill Gates at Microsoft has attested to this, where I think it was him that said, you apply technology to a bad process and more or less it just becomes worse. So we're going to learn a little bit today about how these companies function, about how best-in-class companies function. Before we can even look at technology, this is really the first step. So when we think about our business model, think about how a company operates, we're going to borrow a model that came from Harvard. It was an article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago, and it really caught the attention of quite a few people here at Lectra who we'd seen it go by and kind of latched onto it. And it's what we always come back to internally when we look at the value that we can offer our own customers. So, you can draw parallels from this. So there are basically four components. The first component is the customer value proposition, and that, in short, is basically what value do you offer the customer. So how do you help customers resolve a fundamental problem? What is the customer need, and how do you fulfill this need? And then, of course, you need an offer that meets this need. So that's the first step. The second component is profit formula, or basically how do you create value for yourself while also providing value to the customer. That's key because you need to create something for yourself, value for yourself, in order to stay in business, and you can't give too much away or you'll go out of business, and you can't give not enough away or you will also go out of business. So this comes down to a bunch of financial components like the revenue model, the cost structure, margin model, and the resource velocity, or basically your turnover of goods, how quickly you can convert inventory into assets. And then we have key resources. The most obvious key resource are your people. So if you don't have anybody to do all this stuff for you, you're kind of in a tight situation. But it also comes down to technology, the products, brands, and intellectual property is something, of course, very, very important to fashion. And then your channels, your distribution, so your retail facilities or any kind of e-commerce channels that you've created for yourself. And then the last component are the key processes, or basically how you get stuff done. So recurring tasks, your rules, your metrics, your norms. So all of these four components we'll see, are put together in different combinations across the fashion industry so that each company in the end is unique and offers a unique value to the customer. And essentially, if you don't, you will be out of business. So let's put that aside for a second. We're going to come back to it after we look at a little snapshot of what's happening in the market. The fashion market has been in a major state of flux since 2008, as I've mentioned, and there are a couple of trends that are coming, things that are simmering that we see around the world that are going to impact us all, I would say, for the years to come, especially in more retail and brand mature markets like the US and Europe. So if we take a step, let's look at very, very basic information. We look at the market. We look at where retail sales are coming from and what they're predicted to be over the next couple of years. If we take a snapshot of a 20-year period of time, we see a breakdown where this is billions of dollars. So this is saying that in the year 2000, the apparel sales, excluding accessories, which is important, apparel sales were about $720 billion, and this is scheduled to go up, this is predicted to go up to $1.7 trillion by 2020. So if we look at the breakdown of where this growth is expected to come from, we see the gray countries represent the more mature markets. So we see the US and Europe in there, we see Japan in black, and then part of the BRICS, so this excludes Russia, but we see India, China, and Brazil in red. And we see that the percentage, the weight of these red countries is growing. So if we look at from 2000 to 2010, the increase is growing. We see it growing in this pattern here. And then if we look at the spike now up to 2020, we see that there's another wave of growth that's set to occur where basically we see that overall in mature countries, the growth from 2010 to 2020 was only about 2% per year, whereas the growth for these emerging regions is set to be 8% per year. So even though overall we are, as people, consuming more fashion and more apparel over time, there's certain regions that are going to grow more quickly than others. And then we see a little bit of the breakdown, a finer analysis, and basically if we look at the numbers in a different way, we will see that a big spike in growth is in fact going to come from China. So China, we see, is getting ready to explode as far as demand, and now we look at the production side or the supply side. What's going on there? There's been a lot of talk about companies moving out of China because the cost of labor is increasing and because of a host of other factors. So let's see now what this looks like. If we look at this graph, we have data basically mapped out, apparel exports. So global apparel exports are in the white line, shown in the white line. And we see that this is increasing from 1995 to 2011, where it's over double. If we look at the red line, this is showing the percentage of Chinese apparel exports. So what percentage of the overall apparel that's being exported, which percentage comes from China? And we see that even though demand is still growing in China, domestic demand is still growing in China, we see that they are continuing to export quite a bit. And this is not really predicted to slow down. So China is really in a leading position of both producing for its own population as well as producing for the rest of the world. So I mentioned that in China we've seen wages increase by quite a bit over the past couple of years. Here's just a little bit of information about the different regions within China, and we can see a huge spike where wages are easily doubling in some of the apparel and the concentrations of apparel production, the regions that focus a lot on this. There was an article that came out just a couple of weeks ago that talks about basically the cost of producing, not specifically apparel, but goods in general, between the U.S. and China. When you add in the cost of wages, the cost of shipping, the cost of social charges, social security, things like this, healthcare, actually the difference is much, much less significant than it used to be in the past, and it only costs about, on average, 4% more to produce in the U.S. than to produce that same article in China. So if we look now at the number of pieces produced, because we looked at sales, we see that this is also set to increase from now until 2016. And then we look at, okay, globally, what weight, how much of that is coming from China around the world? we see that at least 50% of that is coming from China. So it's a little bit over 50. We see about 13% of apparel comes out of India, 6% in Bangladesh, 3% in Vietnam, 3% in Turkey, and then we have the rest of the world. So this would include Eastern Europe, North Africa, Latin America, Central America, and then pockets throughout Europe and the U.S. Now, there was a lot of talk about moving production out of China, so we took a look at that as well. So if we look at, here's a mapping of apparel exports in China from 2012. So we see, around the world, we see China with a huge lead in terms of billions of dollars, $169 billion of apparel came out of China. We map that against the number of factories in China and in all these other regions. Again, with the population of people that are able to staff these factories or, in fact, consume what is produced from these apparel factories. And we see very clearly, very, very clearly that China is in the lead with 18,000 factories, a significant population. They have been doing this for a number of years, we don't forget. So there's a certain infrastructure and a skill set and a savoir-faire that is in China that is simply mathematically, when we look at the data, it is not present in other regions. The other region of interest that has a lot of factories is, of course, India, but they're at this point not as organized in the context of apparel export. So we see China for sure is going to continue to be an influence for all of us for the years to come. So now what are some of the other challenges that we see? These are definitely production side challenges, and what are some of the other things we see going on around the world? Well, one of the biggest things that's impacting us all, and this is really a big, big deal, is the amount of stores or the amount of clothing that we simply have at our fingertips today. So one measure of this is the amount of physical store space per person. If we look at the number of square feet that are available in Italy, France, UK, and Japan, we can see where there's a little bit of an unequal distribution. So in Italy, when we see 1.1 square feet per person, that's not a lot of retail space, actually. And we see in France, it's a little bit more intense. UK and Japan, which we know in Japan, if you've ever been there and you've ever walked around, there are absolutely stores everywhere with all kinds of cool Japanese brands that we don't have necessarily in Europe or the US. Same thing in the UK. But what's really shocking is when we look at the United States, it's really off the chart. So these numbers vary, right, according to different sources, because obviously this is an estimate, and with all the data that I looked at, 28 is a rather conservative number. But basically this means, this is a proof that the U.S. is a hyper-competitive retail market, unlike any other in the U.S. There is no doubt that it is the most competitive market in this context. Because this does not take into account something that we all know, and I'm sure I'll take advantage of, are the millions of options online that we have today at our fingertips. All of us, anybody now, can, of course, use Google, where we can look for clothing. We can all of a sudden take advantage of very sophisticated search engines to find any kind of article of clothing we want. We can have it sorted by kind of dress, or by kind of article of clothing, by color, by size, by delivery option, by price, whatever you can imagine. And then we also can't forget about the big behemoth, and that is Amazon. So when Amazon entered the fashion space, if you read the fashion press at all, you will have noticed that it has been nonstop a topic of conversation, because this is basically making fashion available to anybody, and it's starting to treat fashion more and more as a commodity, which of course is dangerous for those of us in the industry. So all in all, this combined with the new consumer, who is extremely connected and informed, has access to every kind of social media channel that you could hope for, a number of fashion blogs, where we see just an insane number of fashion blogs, an insane number, over 2 trillion Twitter feeds related to fashion now, that the amount of information and the access to different types of clothing, pretty much whatever you want, wherever you want, whatever price you want to pay, has led to some pretty irrational behavior on the part of the consumer. Of course, some of this is our own doing. This is the industry that led the consumer to be this way. But basically it means that consumers today have really high expectations. It's an extremely challenging retail environment. So this overall has led to an incredible oversaturation in the fashion and apparel space that is impacting everyone. So there are many people, many industry leaders like Mickey Drexler from J. Crew who say that there are too many retailers, there are too many brands, there are too many designers, there are too many discount stores, and the predator online companies are selling discount like crazy. So this is really, really tough environment. So some of the strategies, how did we get to this, especially in the U.S., how did this happen? Well, one of the strategies that a lot of companies used, American companies included, is that when it came time to grow, to continue to expand businesses, the logical choice for many companies was to expand geographically speaking. So on the screen, we have a bunch of companies, European companies actually, that have expanded into the U.S., into China, a bit all around the world, even to areas like South Africa, Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. This is not an uncommon strategy. It's very common for an American brand or retailer to want to penetrate other English-speaking markets, and they will often stop in the UK first, perhaps trying Canada on the way over before they cross the pond. But of course, European companies are playing the same game, and it's now not uncommon. If you walk up and down Fifth Avenue in New York, you see all of these names. Of course, anyone who's been to Shanghai, you'll recognize all these names from the numerous shopping centers and stores that are scattered about the city. So some examples, because the proof, of course, is in the data. If we take 5 big companies, Ralph Lauren, Abercrombie & Fitch, Gap, Inditex, and Uniqlo, we can see the percentage of their sales growth, which percentage comes from domestic sales, meaning their home country, and which is coming from international sales growth. So we can see that Abercrombie, this is obviously a big deal for them. Uniqlo, we know, fast retailing, they're making a huge shift where they're shifting from Japan, from China, into the U.S., making certain acquisitions, but also opening up their own stores. Inditex, of course, has been doing this a long time, and so has Gap. And even here, even in Paris, there's a very awesome, really cool Ralph Lauren store. But of course, it's not just these guys. So we have some of the big guns. Here's from H&M's annual report, where they're saying that the strong pace of expansion continues in 2013 with a planned 350 stores. The highest rate of expansion will be in China and the U.S. There's also a great potential for expansion in other markets such as Russia, Germany, the UK, Italy, Poland, and France. And we see the number of stores listed in the column in the bar graph, where it's just amazing. The thing that I find super interesting about all this is not so much that they're targeting what we consider to be developed countries, but when you look at the last number, the 1,001 rest of the world stores, this I think is very telling because it means obviously they're having a bigger and bigger footprint outside what we would consider retail mature markets. So this is fast fashion, huh? It's low cost fast fashion that's going to have an impact on everybody. So Inditex, of course, is following suit, saying that they're placing their bet on Asia. They're planning on opening between 80 and 100 stores in China alone in the coming years. It already has more than 400 in China, and we can see the breakdown now of their different brands and what they plan on doing with that. So another strategy that we see coming, mainly out of the U.S., these tend to be more mature brands that have been around for a while, is the idea of spin-offs. So spin-offs are sister brands that might take the same brand DNA and they try to spin it off to target a slightly different population. That population could be lower in terms of income or wanting to spend less on apparel, as is the case with Old Navy and Gap. It could be targeting a younger audience, a hipper, cooler audience, as we see with Madewell, and it could be more casual, as we see with Lou Gray coming up from Ann Taylor. But basically, there are critics in the industry that say that this is a mostly harmless strategy, but it's borrowed equity. If you're successfully engaging people and making a lot of money, then you don't have to do a spin-off. Companies are not spending as much time as they need to be looking at their core brands. So spin-offs can be successful, they can be very fruitful, but they can also be very, very dangerous because, again, you risk diluting your brand and you're not really creating organic demand as you would if you started a different brand or maybe in a different region targeting a different kind of population. So one of the things that's plaguing our industry that personally I find so depressing and it makes me want to cry at night is the sameness that we see over and over in fashion now. And it's a long quote, but it's a really important quote from Jorgen Andersen, who's the CMO of Uniqlo, ex-CMO of H&M, so it's someone who's pretty connected and pretty much knows what he's talking about in the industry. And he says, since fashion went digital, everyone has access to the same information at the same time, and a lot is still very influenced by what goes on at large luxury houses. Most shopping centers and main shopping streets have the same stores, many of them vertical retailers owned by multinational corporations who all have the same goal, to make money and to expand. In order to do so, they have to look at what trends can be adapted for the mass market, which means that the products are pretty much the same everywhere. Anyone who goes to a shopping mall or a shopping center and walks around, if you pay attention to what's in the store windows, if you pay attention to what collections are being presented, you will see the same trends over and over, a different riff off of the same trend, which is unfortunate if you happen to not like the trend that's popular at the time. So let's play a little game. Let's see to what extent this is true. So we've taken 5 brands, okay, well-known brands, where I'm sure that you know some, if not all of these, and let's try to guess which article of clothing came from which brand. So here are 5 pictures, and these are all dresses, little black dresses that we just took off of these companies' websites just last week. So this is actually what is selling today, right now. And try to imagine which dress comes from which brand, which image is associated with this brand, which brand. If you're like me, I really had a hard time, and I was wrong. It was impossible. So let's give a little hint. I'll give you the prices of each garment. So these are the prices in euros, as these were taken from European sites. And if you're like me, you will find that it's not very helpful. So this speaks to, and then we'll show you which one came from where, so you won't be up at night worried about it. But this just goes to the point. It shows that it's an extremely competitive market, again, on a worldwide basis where production and quality issues aside, in terms of branding and styling, there's less and less differentiation happening in the marketplace. So Ms. Vanessa Friedman from the Financial Times, who's now with the New York Times, head of fashion pages, tells us that things are safer today. Word is that retailers will no longer take gambles on new designers or on old designers with new looks or on any look that doesn't look like the last look that sold well, because they make their buy according to the buy that worked the season before, because it is, say it with me, safer. So this is terribly, terribly, terribly depressing. So what is a company to do? So what do we see different companies in the market doing, in the industry doing? What do we see in terms of best practices? So here are some business strategies that we see emerging. So I've grouped these into 4 categories, looking at the core business model of a company, looking at newness and design, fit, and the challenges associated with that, and then different sourcing strategies. Of course, there are many, many others, but those would require a second webinar that we couldn't fit in today. So first, let's look at business model. So if we did a breakdown, this came from an article in the Wall Street Journal. So I'm sure that many of you have gobs and gobs of this information about your own products, and you will find a similar situation. But this is a breakdown of a pair of True Religion jeans, so a very high-end premium jean that's known for being very discreet, not a lot of flashy logos or anything like that, just a good quality pair of pants, with a retail price of $310. So as you know, we can see right above the $310 that the projected wholesale price is about half. And if we look at the cost, we're going to see that that's about half. So how do we get to this $300? The cost, of course, doubled equals the wholesale price. The general rule of thumb, no surprise. We take the wholesale price times 2, and then we get the retail price. What's interesting is if we take this equation and now we look at the different steps involved in creating apparel and the different players within the apparel industry, we see that this would mean that a brand can make about 50% margin a distributor or a retailer is going to make between 20 and 30%, and then a manufacturer is going to make typically between 10 and 15%. Now, this is maybe a little bit optimistic, because one trend that we see coming out now, which is really paints a picture about how difficult the situation has become, is that we see from the Women's Wear Daily, factories generally make between 1 and 3% net margin. For the past 2 decades, middlemen have been squeezing suppliers, which make close to no profit. We can speak from experience with this here at Lectra over the past 2 years. I'm here broadcasting from the Lectra campus in Bordeaux. Over the past 2 days, we've had an event where we had many, many customers, about 50 customers, 40 customers, with us for 2 days of workshops and presentations. And just in chatting with them, because some of them are our producers, they are, from around the world, where they are indeed seeing the same thing, where it's not uncommon for a supplier now, a producer, to make 2% margin, which is very, very low. This, I think, speaks to the state of the fashion industry, where basically we risk becoming a commodity. And this is similar to what's happened to our farmers. It's similar to what happens with milk, for example, where the cost of a quart of milk, the price of a quart of milk is actually lower than the cost of producing and getting it to you. So we don't want this to happen. So what are companies doing? So we break down the market into basically 3 profiles or 3 types of companies. This is, of course, an oversimplification, but it's a complex industry, and we can't look at too many variables at a time. If we break this down into retailers, or those with expertise in the art of retail, so managing channels, worrying about customer display, visual merchandising, margin, do we discount, not discount, that's one segment. The middle segment are brands, so those companies that are focused on innovation and storytelling. And then the last segment are the apparel manufacturers, and of course their DNA is based upon production-related issues like throughput, ROI, turnover, cost, producing to cost, producing to quality while meeting time limits. We see now very deep changes in the industry, where we see that brands are moving to own manufacturing facilities as well as retail facilities. And if we take some of the luxury brands, we see that they are buying tanneries. So they're buying tanneries that do exotic skins like alligator or snake skin, so that they can not only control the process, but they can also guarantee a supply of rare raw materials. But there are many, many examples of this. We see that retailers are definitely getting into branding. Some of them are also going back and buying factories. And then we see very striking, and this is probably the biggest change that's going to impact everybody, we see more and more manufacturers, especially big Chinese companies, whose holdings include apparel. Maybe their main business is not apparel. Sometimes their main businesses could be things like real estate, television. I've heard of some owning stadiums. They own all kinds of stuff, but they also do apparel. They are now buying brands, so they're starting to own brands and their own stores. Here at Lectra, we have a number of customers in China, and we looked at our customers and what they're doing today, some of the changes they're making, and we found that between 60 and 70% of apparel manufacturers are now starting their own brands, and if not, their own retail operations. So this is significant, because these guys are very good at producing, they are very good at managing their margins, and they're essentially buying seasoned talent from European and American companies to come in and do the brand, help build product, help build a story, help build DNA. It's a very, very interesting development. So what's happening with all this? What does this mean for us? Is we take our retailers, we take our brands, we take our manufacturers, and we see them merging. So we see more and more the development of a hybrid business model. So it's not only hybrid in terms of branding, retailing, manufacturing, but companies are also adding concurrent business models within their companies. So a couple of examples, okay, to be a little concrete about it. When we look at Gap, we all go to the Gap today, so we can think it's a retailer, but this is a company, we think it's a brand, but this is a company that was actually a retailer, where back in my day, when I was a kid, I used to go to the Gap and buy Levi's. I'm sure some of you remember that, but today, of course, they're known for their own products. Nike, we all know the story there, where Bill Bowerman and Phil Knight started selling shoes out of the back of a car after Bill Bowerman experimented with new soles using his wife's waffle iron. But of course, today, if you were to go to Nike, if you want to buy Nike goods, you go to NikeTown, or you go on Nike.com and you order it yourself. And then the last one is a little bit less well-known today, but I'm sure it'll be more well-known in the future, and that is Anastasia, who is a Chinese manufacturer, where the gentleman who started this company started manufacturing outerwear as his goal was to make enough money to start his own brand. And he has, and he's been extremely successful. And today, when you look at the branding of this company, it is on par with the Gap and Nike. In fact, it's difficult to tell them apart, aside from the models. So if we look at, as I was saying, the different competing business models within a company organization. Okay, if we simplify and we mix up, we just group together brands and retailers, since we see now with the Nike Gap example, there are hundreds of companies like this where it's more and more difficult to say, is it a brand, is it a retailer? You know what, they're doing both, and more companies are starting this way, like a Tory Burch and a Michael Kors, for example. They're mixing this model. Within a lot of companies, and again, we know, Zara, Uniqlo, H&M, we can study their businesses, and we know at Lectra from working with them, but we see within any given company now, we see different ways of working or concurrent business models. So if we start on the right, in the black, we see that there are basics, and we look at the 4 components of the business model that I explained in the beginning of the presentation. We see that basics are all about price for value. Okay, so it's a high margin, high volume, high margin business with very controlled costs. It tends to be a long track development cycle, slow process, lowest cost manufacturing. So the goal here is not time, it's cost. Say it's producing for the least cost possible. And this is a traditional apparel process. It tends to require lower skill sets because we're talking about basic t-shirts, basic underwear, socks, things like this without a high design component. If we look at the left-hand side, we can see the fast fashion, and not all companies call it this, but in effect, more and more of them are doing this in parallel with the basics, and it's often a separate team. They're running based on trends. So they're running based on trends predicted by a big trend agency, like a Style Site or a WGSN, which is not the same company, but one of these, or they're running off of straight trends, bloggers, shopping trips, what have you, but they're focused on trends. Here, the preference is, or the priority is time. So trends are used to drive traffic. The margins on each product sold tend to be lower. There's a fast track development. Nearshore manufacturing is very often used with fabric platforming and or garment platforming being part of the process, which you can imagine the havoc that wreaks on traditional sourcing teams because it's a completely different way of working. Teams tend to be cross-functional for maximum agility and then sharing of expertise. So it's not uncommon that you would have a retail specialist, a designer, a product developer, or a pattern maker, a sample maker, and maybe a garment technologist all working on the same team, someone with a lot of production expertise that really understands the capabilities of the supply chain, because the idea here is to get the right product as quickly as possible. That will contrast also with another type of business model that we see, capsule collections. H&M has been key in piloting this. We also see Target out of the U.S. Different companies, Banana Republic right now is doing one, which is quite interesting. And here the name of the game is exclusivity, displaced innovation. The goal is to drive traffic. Margins tend to be lower, if not break even in some cases, because the royalty fees or the licensing fees can be extremely high. These tend to be micro teams. There's another fast track development. And again, we need to be cross-functional. We need a very tightly controlled distribution, and you want to control the buzz. So it's more or less a marketing exercise. And again, the idea is to build exclusivity and to try to make yourself stand out from the crowd. So this is all good and well. But these guys in general are not actually producing the garments themselves. So let's look at, for manufacturers, what does this mean? If we take the same criteria, so the 4 components of the business model, we look at fast fashion, capsule, and basics, we can see here the differences in terms of, I guess we would say, the stakes or the interest. So for the basics, remember that the retailer or the brand is going to make more money because cost to them is the priority, And for a manufacturer, they're actually going to make a lower margin on that because they really don't have a lot of room to negotiate, because we're talking about standard products that really don't have a lot of value add or a lot of differentiation in the marketplace. But when we get to the fast fashion and the capsule, this is where the manufacturers will make their margin, because, of course, the priority is time, and people are generally willing to pay a little bit more to get something quickly. So this is having a huge impact, as you can imagine, on teams, because it means now the skill sets are totally different. People absolutely have to have a sound process and very strong technology. You need a strong technological backbone in order to manage this chaos, because you can imagine the overlapping calendars, the logistics involved, the expertise involved. Your designers have to be technically proficient. Your manufacturers have to be sensitive to your design aesthetic and your fit needs. So it really means rethinking of your process and how you work. The next big trend that we see, the next big thing coming, is newness and design. The newness is nothing new. We've seen this around for a little while now, where we see that the fast fashion companies like Inditex and H&M have really driven this idea home. And why? It's because we drive store visits. By having new collections all the time, we can see that the average number of customer visits per year goes from 3 to 6 to 15 to 20 with fast fashion, because basically we're just shopping around, looking around, seeing if we can find something interesting. And people do. So we can see that the average markdown is actually a lot lower with fast fashion, because, again, I want it now, need it now. If I don't buy it today, it'll be gone tomorrow. And then this has meant that the number of seasons has also exploded. So we're moving now from 2 to 4, as was traditionally, to 24 to 12 to 24, which again plays to the complexity of the product development team. In many organizations, people are just being pushed to do more with the same amount of resources or in the same amount of time. And I can definitely state that with my 20 years in the industry, people in the industry are more and more stressed now than they have ever been before, which is unfortunate. So we can see across the board that it's not this idea of newness is not just a trend with fast fashion companies. Here's a study that came out of the UK with Drapers, where they have basically done a bunch of research, and we see that the number of drops per season has increased. So we still stay in general with 2 seasons a year, but the number of drops has increased to 33, which means that basically there are 66 little mini collections coming in throughout the year, which is a lot, several per month, which is a big deal. 22% of those surveyed see us moving to no season, because that is effectively what this is. And then the companies that were surveyed were basically women's wear and luxury, but they feel that it's happening to them. And most people surveyed are planning to increase the number of drops per season. So what does this mean? It means that we're basically moving to a seasonless industry, or continuous replenishment. One person on the forefront of this who's extremely interesting is Tamara Mellon. So Tamara Mellon was the head of Jimmy Choo, which she sold, and now started her own company. So we can see here what her website looks like, just to get an idea of the things that she produces. And she, of course, has the benefit of starting a new company from scratch, which means that she can build these changes in the business model directly from the foundation up. It's a lot more difficult for companies to work in an old way and then change. It is possible, and we see this all the time, but it definitely requires assistance. It requires expertise. But basically, Mellon's philosophy is a buy now, wear now. So most of Mellon's pieces are seasonless, but her real goal is to ensure that the clothes she is selling in store match the weather outside. She sells 4 times a year, and each collection is split into 3 deliveries, which means that, much like a high street operation, there are new clothes available each month. The seasonless part is key as well, because now if you're looking at geographic expansion and you're looking at selling in the southern hemisphere, managing the cold weather, warm weather component becomes a bit trickier. So we see overall, in addition to more frequent deliveries, overall we see that consumers are moving from a price to value shift. They're becoming more and more design sensitive. This is obvious, so obvious in China now when you walk around, and even in Japan or in other countries where consumers were pretty much typically thought of as less mature in terms of buying preferences and discretion. But we see today that the logoed bag has become the secretary's bag, where there has been a big shift, not only in Asia, but in general, where people are shunning logos. They want something much, much more discreet. We see this with the rise in popularity of brands like Celine, which are very understated, simple, beautiful lines. You don't need a lot of bling on top of that. So this is definitely a trend. It's been all over the runways for the past year or two. The other big trend we see is just some companies, and again, this is coming out of luxury, but luxury is on the forefront of many trends, not just in terms of fashion trends, as in what color is trendy, but in terms of how we work and being innovative in terms of business model, and that is beautiful design. So here's a photo of beautiful designs that came from Vogue, and we see very clearly that within the luxury houses, there has been a huge shift. The power of the designer is absolutely growing, and we can see that there are several companies that are doing this, but specifically if we take Kering, because Kering is a very design-friendly company, but they have a whole roster of famous designers now, young labels that they've acquired. A lot of these designers design for a Kering brand, but also maintain their own labels, and this is a way to let them have creativity in their jobs, to have creative reign. We see others, such as Lagerfeld, Galliano, before he was kicked out of Dior, Marc Jacobs, et cetera, et cetera. Vanessa Friedman tells us that this casts successful designers less as work for hire and more as integral assets. So we see, again, a shift where the priority is design, it's having unique products that customers will pay more for. And this is a strategy that can be applied to an accessible luxury, a premium luxury price point, or even a good ready-to-wear price point. Another big thing that we have in fashion that is, of course, unique to us is fit. So I think we all remember Jennifer Lopez wearing this dress, and I asked myself, I'm sure we all did, what would happen if it didn't fit perfectly? Can you imagine the fashion faux pas that would have burned up the internet? So fit is a huge concern. And one of the strategies a lot of brands and retailers think to have, or even manufacturers getting into their own branding and retailing, is that they'll simply open up an e-commerce store. We can see in fashion, in terms of clothing, that there's still a long way to go before this becomes massive, big business. We can see that overall, about 13% of clothing is bought online. Contrast that to shoes, which are about 20%. And then if we compare that to more staple goods like books, electronics, the percentages get higher and higher, ranging from 30 to 40%. So e-commerce is generally, it's still in its infancy, but we all know that it's coming, and it's definitely coming quicker and quicker. 80% of clothing sold in stores is tried on first. So that attests to the necessity and the complexity involved in fit. I'm sure you have the same experience that I do, where you really don't wear the same size in any brand. You never wear the same size twice. It seems it's a challenge. I tend to stick with the brands I know because I know they fit me, and I think a lot of people do the same thing. So we cannot underestimate the importance of fit as far as having loyal customers. So of the clothing bought online, 33% of customers are unhappy, but only 21% will return the item. So that's, there are a lot of unhappy people out there. 70% of clothing returns are due to poor fit, and we have found in our research that a 1% reduction in the rate of returns equals a 1% increase in profits. And this comes from fitsme.com, where they've studied basically the cost of returning goods, the fact that some goods returned, clothing returned online is never reinjected back into inventory for various reasons, but basically the cost of doing so is extremely high. The time to pay for shipping, to reintegrate everything, et cetera, et cetera. So honestly, it's better to avoid the whole issue if you can. One innovative strategy that's popping up is AYR, who's a division that's part of the Bonobos company, and they're putting together what they call guide shops. So guide shops are little retail spaces where they basically have one of everything, and the objective is you go in, you try things on, and then you place your order online. So you do not walk out with a big shopping bag full of stuff that you have to lug around. Of course, you don't get the sense of immediate gratification, but for those of us who don't enjoy carrying bags around all the time, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We like that one. Uniqlo, made for all, how appropriate a slogan, has found that when they went to penetrate the U.S., so going back to the idea of geographic expansion, that one of the roadblocks that they ran into was indeed fit and sizing. So they say in the U.S. there are many different ethnic groups, and this makes it tough to come up with an optimal range to match fit, and that is very, very, very much the case. We see now more and more complex sizing in a lot of our customers, especially those with flagship stores in major cities like Paris, New York, Shanghai, where you really have a heavily, heavily international population. It is very difficult to target a typical morphology because you really have people from all around the world coming in. So we see in some of these larger flagship stores, if you walk around, look at the clothing that's there, you'll see way more in terms of sizes to choose from than you would in a typical store that's maybe in a smaller city where the population tends to be a little bit more homogeneous. So fit is obviously something we at Lectra know a lot about, as that is the core of our business. The next thing that we see happening, of course, is sourcing. Over the past couple of years, with the shifts in labor cost in China, and then, of course, the cost of raw materials really fluctuating, it's been pretty clear that sourcing is more and more of a strategic component in any business model, so that logistics and supply chain are more and more important. Many companies, including PVH, we also see VF with their third way, and many, many other companies are now agreeing that there is a complete interdependency between retailers and their producers. So they're starting to work more and more with their suppliers on end-to-end supply chain solutions, lean manufacturing models, and just-in-time relationships. This is very interesting. It's also a trend that we see here at Lectra, where companies now are looking to inject a lean methodology or a lean approach from the conception stage, so from product development or design all the way down to production. Because as we know, with lean, it doesn't work nearly as well if you don't integrate the entire process. It doesn't really work when you silo processes. In fact, it's all about the opposite of doing that. So we see with the supply chain, if we look at what's happening today, we try to look at this visually, get a graphic on this, we can see that the supply chain of the 90s was all about the plan, design, sample, select, source, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the different steps required to develop fashion, and they happen in a very sequential manner. So we used to have the luxury of finishing our planning before we started the next step. Then when fast fashion started to influence everybody, everyone said, you know what, do it faster, do it faster, do it faster. And there's a point in time where you can only work so fast, you just can't handle the pressure, or you start making mistakes, or things just take a certain amount of time. There's no way that you can accelerate. So just accelerating doesn't work. So today, what we see more and more is a really, truly integrated supply chain or supply flow, where we see roles and responsibilities mixing and merging more and more. So sourcing is blending with design. Design has to have a deep production knowledge. They have to understand finishing details. You need to understand fit. The technical people have to understand the creative needs, et cetera, et cetera. And this, again, is something that when it happens and when you get it right, it's really kind of cool. And you're able to be very, very agile and produce a really awesome product. And applying technology smartly makes a big difference, where if you use things like 3D product development solutions, we can cut down the number of samples. We can eliminate the pattern, the paper pattern. We can, on a repurposed or a carryover item, we don't need to do a sample all the time. So we can start to cut time out of the development cycle. Things like color management solutions, where you can eliminate lab dips. You start to catalog the colors that you know certain suppliers can produce in certain substrates. These are all little things that can help accelerate the process. And of course, there are many, 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 many more. So this is a big, big subject. So that brings us back to the last section of our webinar, where I'll explain a little bit about who we are at Lectra and how we came to have all this knowledge. So we at Lectra, in the fashion market, our mission is quite simple. It's not simple. It's a challenge, but it's a joy at the same time. It's to provide fashion brands, retailers, and manufacturers with collection management, product conception and production solutions to excel in front of 21st century challenges. So all of the challenges that we've just seen, this is what we help companies with all the time, every day. So who are we to say this? Well, these are a few of our customers. So this attests a little bit to our pedigree, where you can see a wide range of both retailers, brands, and manufacturers that come from all different corners of the world, and at all different price points and all different sectors. So it really is quite cool. The other thing that we do that's very important to us is we have partnerships with almost 900 schools in 60 countries around the world. The objective for us is to help students prepare for their careers. We give technology donations to these schools, and a lot of schools use Lectra technology in the course of their teaching. So, for example, in order to illustrate how the properties of woven fabrics, they will use our different design and product development solutions to show the different weave patterns, to show how the different effects on fibers, colors, hang on a garment, drape, things like that. We are made in France. Many, many years ago, the management team here at Lectra had to decide whether or not to outsource our R&D and the building of our cutting machines and our hardware to different lower-cost regions. At the time, it would have been very advantageous for Lectra to do so, and in fact, the management team had decided steadfastly, much against the advice of many, many analysts and shareholders, they decided to keep everything within France. So everything that we produce today is indeed made in Europe, and as I mentioned, I'm here at the Bordeaux campus. I can walk across the campus and check out my 260 friends in the R&D department, our programmers. So for these 260 R&D engineers, we've invested 174 million euros over the past 10 years, which is quite a chunk of change. So what do we do with all that? The core of our expertise is, of course, technology. We have taken 40 years of different, at the time, desktop solutions, because this is what people used back then, and we have, over the years, been plugging them into what we call the Lectra Fashion Platform. So this now is a full end-to-end solution where we start at the planning office, covering budgeting, line plan, critical path management, design, so color management, knit, print, and weaves for textiles, concept development, boards, design briefs, going into sampling, product development with both flat pattern making and 3D sampling and product development solutions, backpacks, grading, et cetera, development and production, so costing, pre-costing, sample management, vendor management, industrialization, and of course fabric optimization, which is significant, and then into our cutting room for both fabric and leather, so cutting and spreading. As I mentioned before, we are injecting a lean approach into all this, which is really quite interesting. So in a nutshell, we speak fashion. And why can I say that? It's because we have 450 business experts, solution experts, customer care teams, and project managers behind us. So we have everyone from knitting specialists, weaving specialists, to people who understand children's wear, to luxury, menswear, leather cutting, different types of fabric, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite an impressive team. As I mentioned, we've changed our approach because technology on its own is not enough today, absolutely not enough, where we now have a new professional services approach, a consultative approach that is based on lean principles and change management. As you can imagine, when you implement something like a PLM solution or 3D product development, the change management is huge. If we take the 3D, for example, all of a sudden designers, pattern makers can see the samples, they can see the same visual, they can share that with suppliers, they can share that with different teams, and sometimes creates power struggles where you have certain people who like to be owners of information who don't necessarily want to share, even though the process overall is greatly improved. So sometimes we have to be a bit sensitive to that. So in conclusion, we're reaching the end of our presentation. 3 rules for making a company truly great. So this is something I pinched out of Harvard Business Review. A lot of people when this article came out were passing it around one to another, and it's really great advice. So a study based on thousands of companies. Number 1 rule, better before cheaper. Second rule, revenue before cost. And the third rule is that there are no other rules. So I leave that with you today. We will open it up now to questions. So if you have any questions, Heather's been noting them as the WebEx has been continuing, has been going on. So Heather, are there any questions for us today, or are we?
There are. We do have some questions, but sadly we set them all a challenge to try and beat the amount that we had this morning. But at the moment they've failed. But keep them coming if you want me to ask some questions. So as it stands, we have a couple of questions from Sylvia Cobos, and I'll give you the questions as follows. So first of all, what is your opinion on Western Hemisphere sourcing as a nearshore destination for the US to meet demands of current Want It Now customers?
I think that's awesome. I think it's totally feasible. We definitely have customers. We definitely have customers, in the U.S., in Canada, in high wage regions like France, Germany, Italy, UK, who are starting to produce, and it absolutely can be done. Well, it has to be done very, very smartly. You definitely have to have a smart application of technology. There have been a couple of articles that we've published on the subject. We recently had a conference in New York with the CFDA, the Council of Fashion Designers of America, the AAPN, he's going to kill me if I don't remember this, the Producers Network, American Apparel Producers Network, where basically we got into a lot of these details. But yes, it's possible. It's coming online. There's more and more buzz. It's been going on, frankly, in Europe for a long time. They've just been very smart about it. There's definitely production still in Italy, for example, that never left, as well as in France. So, yeah, we're on board. We've thumbs up.
Great. That's brilliant. Thanks. Okay. What about providing measurement charts to buyers on online platforms? Is it used a lot?
No. We at Lectra, we don't provide measurement charts. We can, of course, manage that data, but many brands today are, they're moving away from standard measurement charts because we see that now that doesn't work, right? A generic, non-value-added approach doesn't work. So brands and retailers are developing their own measurements to target their own populations, and they can do this in a number of ways. There's a lot of body scanning technology now that's coming out. There's a lot better data that's coming out, better mannequins. One of the things we see is the explosion of more incremental sizes. Okay, I know there was an article recently in the Wall Street Journal that talked about the dumbing down of size, or how companies are moving more and more to a small, medium, large approach. That is absolutely not the trend here in Europe. In fact, I think people would be pretty unhappy if that were the case, because fit tends to be even more of a concern here. But no, we see also the explosion of the introduction of special sizing, special grading, which means that instead of taking standard grade rules where we're doing, as the waist, for example, of a pair of pants increases from a 4 to a 6 to an 8, or a 32, 34, 36, instead of doing a straight, inch or 2 inches every time, sometimes we're seeing on the lower end or the higher end of the scale, that increment needs to change. So it's much more about adapting fit to your own target population and not taking someone else's generic fit and their measurement chart.
Brilliant. Thanks for answering that one, Stacey. Okay, another one from Sylvia. Are Lectra working, providing services with manufacturers in South America?
We do. I'm not quite sure what Sylvia means by working or providing services with, but we absolutely work with manufacturers in South America, definitely in Brazil and Colombia, Argentina, all over the place. So, yeah, absolutely. But if Sylvia has more detailed questions about that, she can feel free to contact me directly.
Yes, absolutely. I can pass on your details. That's fine. Okay, a question from Trevor Little. How does the integrated supply flow of the future change the way technology solutions will be configured or offered?
Hi, Dr. Little. Dr. Little is my old professor at NC State.
Is that right? Fantastic.
There's a huge impact, absolutely a huge impact. We're definitely seeing, really out of China, there's a huge push for PLM, where more and more manufacturers are getting into the game, whereas for them, PLM has traditionally been something that they've been asked to use by a brand or a retailer. I can't disclose who, but we're talking to a number of big manufacturers for PLM that we never really would have thought to approach, but due to different discussions has come on the table. And then there are a lot of other things that we have in the works in our roadmap. So I don't want to comment too much about that. But the other big thing we see, as I mentioned, is a huge infusion of a lean methodology or a lean approach in the manufacturing, in the supply chain. And we've done at Lectra a couple of really cool projects with manufacturers in China and in Europe, where we're essentially reworking a process, because we've seen over the years that companies tend to, when they want to increase capacity or make a change, one of their first reflexes is actually to buy more technology. They think, oh, I need a couple more licenses of pattern making. That means we'll be more efficient, or I need to add in an extra license of something else, and will be more efficient. And it doesn't seem very intuitive, but what we've been doing is actually, for our customers that we work with for a long time, we challenge those decisions and say, well, why? We've been to your site, we've worked with your teams, we don't think you're leveraging technology enough. In fact, for one of our biggest customers, they had the shock of their lives when we told them that they were probably only leveraging 30% of what they had in terms of capability of the technology that they already owned from us. So we see it's expertise. It's more and more about process. It's more and more about the way you work, not necessarily what you work with.
Excellent. And I'm sure Dr. Little is very proud of you, Stacey.
No, he has my email, so if he's not happy with my answer, he'll hunt me down. And I'm so happy he can't respond.
Oh, no, that's lovely. We have another question from Julie Vargas. She says, how does trim play into the planning process, care labels, etc.?
It's one piece of the puzzle like any other, huh? It's not. It's a component. It can be handled the way everything else has. And there's some, we'll call them non-value added activities where there's no point in recreating certain care labels. Definitely the reflex is to repurpose things as much as possible. And then when you want to go into creating more of a unique label, it's part of the design. But it really trims are handled just as any other component for a garment.
Fantastic. And the final question from Andrew Lambert. Is there anything that Lectra can do with colour management for the end user to reduce the incidence of product returns because of unpredictable or unexpected colour?
That would be a whole technical discussion that I would need to understand a little bit better, and I would suggest that Andrew contact me directly again. I don't want to brush the question off, but color is extremely complex. For years now, We've had partnerships with both Pantone and X-Rite, where there's a whole science behind it. It's an extremely complex project. In the U.S., we just announced a partnership with SpectraFlow. It's a color specialist that we work with to help implement these kinds of solutions for our customers. So it's really a different discussion, I think.
Perfect. Incidentally, Dr. Trevor Little says thank you for your answer. I've mentioned that. And I think that's it. Everybody has asked the questions that they wanted to, and I hope you've all enjoyed Stacey's presentation. It's certainly very informative. We will be sending an on-demand version out to everybody who has registered for the event, both this morning and this afternoon. So it can be watched again at your leisure. In the meantime, if you do have any other questions that you would like us to send through to Stacey, you can send them direct to me if you wish. It's heather@just-style.com, and I'll be happy to pass them on for you. Thank you very much, Stacey, for helping us out today with this great webinar. And it's been a very long day, I know, but I hope it's been really informative for everybody that's listened.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day, Dr. Little. I'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.